The morning I opened the Columbus Dispatch at Rosewood Sr., living my breath caught in my chest. There it was, Robert's name printed coldly in the obituary column. My husband of 45 years gone, and worse. His funeral had already been held without me. The paper blurred as tears filled my eyes. My hands shook so hard I could barely hold the phone, but I dialed our son anyway, clinging to the hope that it was some terrible mistake. His voice came sharp-clipped without a trace of compassion. "It's already over. Without you, you're not part of this anymore." In that moment, I felt something break inside me. I hadn't just lost Robert to death, I had lost Daniel to choice. My own son had erased me from the final goodbye. The paper trembled in my hands. I pressed it to my chest as if clutching it could keep my heart from breaking wide open. My body felt cold all at once, as though the air had been sucked from the room. I could hear Helen's voice in the distance, but I couldn't make out her words. All I could see was Robert's face in my memory. The last dinner we had together before Daniel insisted I move here. The way he had passed me the bread with that absent-minded smile, the one I had loved since we first met. I had no idea it would be the last time. My breath grew shallow. I fumbled in my cardigan pocket for the small cell phone I rarely used. My hands shook so violently I almost dropped it as I dialed Daniel's number. He answered on the second ring. "Hello?" His voice was clipped, distracted, as though I was nothing more than an interruption. "Daniel." I managed my voice already breaking. "I just read in the paper. Your father, Robert, he's gone. He's dead. Why didn't you tell me?" There was a pause, heavy and unbearable. Then his answer came flat and cold as ice. "It's already over. Without you. It's not your place anymore." I froze, gripping the phone so hard it dug into my palm. "Not my place, Daniel. I'm his wife. I've been his wife for 45 years. How could you keep this from me?" My voice rose trembling between rage and despair. He gave a short, impatient sigh. "Dad's funeral was last week. It was private. Close friends and family only." His emphasis on family was a knife in my chest. "You wouldn't have wanted to be there anyway." "Not wanted," my voice cracked. "I should have been there. I should have been by his side. He was my husband." Daniel cut me off. "You don't understand, Mom. It's done. You need to let it go." His tone hardened final like a door slammed shut. "Daniel, please," I whispered, but the line had already gone dead. I sat there staring at the silent phone in my hand, unable to breathe. The words echoed inside me, bouncing against the walls of my chest. "Without you, not your place anymore." The newspaper slipped from my lap onto the floor, the black ink smudging against the pale linoleum. Around me, the common room carried on as if nothing had happened. Someone laughed at a television rerun. A nurse wheeled a cart past. The maple leaves outside shivered in the breeze. But inside me something had shattered. I had lost Robert twice. Once to death, and once to my own son's choice to erase me from his final goodbye. I folded forward, pressing my face into my hands, and the tears came hot and bitter. There was no one to hold me, no one to steady me. Only the echo of Robert's name in my ears and the memory of the life we had built, now stolen from me in silence. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat in that chair, a widow who hadn't been allowed to say goodbye, a mother who had been told she no longer belonged. The morning sun slid higher, throwing stripes of light across the floor, and still I sat, my body heavy with grief that felt too sharp to bear. It was already over, Daniel had said, but for me it had only just begun. I leaned back in the chair, my hands still trembling from the phone call, and for a moment I wished I could turn the clock back 45 years back to the beginning when Robert and I first started our life together. We were barely in our 20s when we opened Collins Hardware on the east side of Columbus. The building was small with one squeaky front door and shelves Robert built himself out of pine boards. He worked 12-hour days behind the counter, grease under his fingernails. his back always a little sore from lifting crates. I handled the bookkeeping in the evenings, my training from the courthouse making me meticulous with numbers and contracts. We weren't rich, but we were steady. Robert believed in honest work and paying debts on time and knowing every customer's name. I loved him for that. When Daniel was born in 1985, Robert held him like he was the most fragile thing on earth. For years, we thought our son would inherit that same ethic of care and hard work. We gave him everything we could. New sneakers for Little League private tutors when he struggled in math, even a used car when he turned 16. I wanted him to feel supported, not weighed down by the sacrifices Robert and I had made. But as Daniel grew, I saw a different hunger in his eyes. He talked about skyscrapers and high-rise condos, about money made quickly with a signature instead of a wrench. He rolled his eyes at his father's grease-stained work shirts. Why waste your life fixing broken hinges for $50, he'd say, when you can close a deal and make $50,000? Robert would stiffen at that kind of talk. Because those $50 mean something when they're earned honest, he'd reply, his voice low but firm. I remember the arguments that followed, the way Daniel would slam his bedroom door, and Robert would sit at the kitchen table staring at his calloused hands, shaking his head in disbelief. The older Daniel got, the wider the gap grew. He went to college for real estate, came back wearing suits, talking fast about investments. He looked at Colin's hardware as if it were a relic, an embarrassment. "Sell it," he urged Robert more than once. "Take the money and retire. Let me handle the rest." But Robert refused. "This store built our family," he said. "It will not be tossed aside like junk." In 2019, when Robert's heart condition returned, the conversations changed. We sat down with an attorney and Robert revised his will. He insisted I would have the protection of the spousal elective share no matter what Daniel tried. The house in Bexley, valued then at $350,000, would be mine. Robert wanted me safe. Daniel was named to inherit the business, but with stipulations. He couldn't sell it without board approval, and a share of profits would still come to me. Robert thought he was being fair. I thought he was being too generous. Daniel was there for those meetings. I remember his jaw tightening, the way he folded his arms when the attorney explained the limits. His smile was thin, controlled. He shook Robert's hand and said he understood, but I could see in his eyes a cold calculation. When Robert's health declined further, it was Daniel who stepped forward as the primary contact for doctors and banks. He told me, "Mom, you can't handle the stress. Let me take care of it." And at first I believed him. I wanted to believe my son wanted to help. But soon he began suggesting things that chilled me. He said the house was too much for me, that Rosewood Senior Living was safer with nurses always on hand. He said Robert needed calm, not constant worry about me. And slowly, bit by bit, I was pushed aside. I moved into this facility with the promise it was temporary, that Robert and I would still see each other often. But visits grew fewer. Phone calls became shorter. I didn't realize then how carefully Daniel was building a wall between us. The last dinner I had with Robert before leaving the house is burned into my memory. He passed me the bread, his hand trembling just a little. We didn't speak much. The silence between us was comfortable, the kind built over decades. He squeezed my hand when I stood to clear the plates. That squeeze meant everything. It was love, it was trust, it was his way of telling me we were still in this together. And yet here I was now sitting in a sterile room with beige walls and vinyl floors, reading about his death from a newspaper like a stranger. My own son had orchestrated this silence, had erased me from the moment I should have been standing by my husband's side. I thought of Daniel's face as a boy, freckled and smiling, when Robert taught him to ride his bike in the parking lot behind the store. I thought of the young man he became, swaggering in with a suit and car loan papers. Somewhere along the way, my son had traded family for ambition, loyalty for greed. The truth settled in me, heavy and bitter. Daniel had motive. He had opportunity. He had been waiting for this moment to step into Robert's place and shut me out entirely. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes, willing the tears to stop. But they didn't. The ache was too deep. My husband was gone, and my son had made sure I didn't even have the dignity of saying goodbye. I drew a shaky breath and lifted my head, staring at the maple tree outside the window. Its leaves fluttered in the breeze, oblivious to my grief. A nurse passed by in the hall, humming a tune. Life went on outside this room. Inside me, though, something was beginning to change. My grief was real raw, but it was mixing now with something sharper. Not rage exactly, but a resolve. If Daniel thought he could erase me, he was wrong. I sat straighter, the obituary still folded on the table beside me. The words swam in my vision, but I forced myself to read them again. Services were held. Without me, not your place anymore. He had drawn the line, and I knew with every fiber of me that I would not let it stand. My fingers hesitated over the buttons of my phone, the paper still lying folded beside me like a cruel reminder. For a brief moment I convinced myself that maybe it was a mistake, that perhaps the obituary had been misprinted, that there was some explanation. My heart clung to that tiny shred of hope as I dialed Daniel's number again. He answered quickly this time, his voice clipped. "Mom." One word flat with no warmth at all. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. "Daniel," I whispered, my throat tightening. "Why didn't you tell me about your father? Why did I have to read it in the paper?" There was silence on the other end, heavy and unnerving. Then, in a voice that carried no hesitation, he said, "Because it wasn't your place anymore." The words punched the air out of my chest. Not my place. My voice cracked as I clutched the phone tighter. "I was his wife for 45 years. I was there before you were born. I was by his side through every hardship. How could you say that to me?" Daniel sighed, and the sound was sharp, impatient, as if I were some annoying call interrupting his day. "Dad's funeral was last week. It was private. I didn't think dragging you out of that place would help anyone. You didn't need to be there." My body trembled with rage. I didn't need to be there. He was my husband, Daniel, my partner. You had no right to decide that for me. His tone hardened, turning cruel. He was my father. I made the arrangements. It was about his legacy, about respect. You wouldn't have understood. Tears blurred my vision. Respect, I could barely get the word out. You call shutting his wife out of his funeral respect? His voice dropped lower, laced with bitterness. "You're not part of that family anymore. You're living in a home, Mom. You're not involved. You've been out of it for a long time." The sob broke free before I could stop it. "Daniel, please," I begged, "don't shut me out like this. I loved him. He was my life." The silence that followed felt endless. For a fleeting moment I thought maybe he would soften, maybe he would remember that I was still his mother. But then came the sound of finality, the sharp click of the line going dead. I pulled the phone from my ear, staring at it in disbelief, as though it might come alive again and undo what had just happened. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped it onto the linoleum floor. My breath came in ragged gasps. I pressed the phone to my chest, rocking slightly in my chair. I could hear my own sobs echoing in the sterile quiet of the common room, a sound I barely recognized as mine. I wasn't just mourning Robert anymore. I was mourning Daniel, too. Somewhere along the way I had lost him to something colder, something hungrier than love. Money, power, control. I wasn't sure what had hollowed him out, but the son I remembered teaching to tie his shoes, the boy who used to curl up on Robert's lap to listen to bedtime stories, was gone. In his place was a man who spoke to me as though I were nothing. The weight of it crushed me. My chest hurt, my hands pressed against my face, and hot tears seeped between my fingers. I tried to quiet myself, not wanting the other residents or nurses to hear me unraveling, but it was no use. The grief poured out raw and unrelenting. I thought of Robert again, of the way he used to place his hand over mine when I worried too much. He would tell me Maggie will handle it together. And now, not only was he gone, but my own son had made sure I couldn't even say goodbye. The maple tree outside the window swayed in the breeze, leaves scattering like pieces of my life drifting away. Around me the world continued as if nothing had happened. Dishes clinking from the cafeteria, footsteps in the hall. But I felt utterly alone. I clutched the phone once more before setting it down carefully on the table as if it might shatter under the weight of what had just been said. The words echoed in my head, each repetition cutting deeper. "You're not family anymore." In that moment, I felt the cruelest truth of all. I had lost Robert to death, and I had lost Daniel to choice. The double blow hollowed me out until I was nothing but a shell sitting in that chair staring at a world that had moved on without me. I folded forward, arms wrapped around my body, as though I could hold myself together. But there was no holding together what had been broken. The newspaper lay on the floor, its pages spread wide, Robert's name printed in stark black letters. I couldn't look at it anymore. I turned my face away, closed my eyes, and let the darkness settle in, heavy and suffocating. That was how the morning ended. Me in that chair clutching the emptiness where my family had once been, knowing nothing would ever be the same again. The next afternoon, Helen stopped by my table, her arms full of folders and charts. She lowered her voice as she leaned closer. "Mrs. Collins, there was a man here yesterday from First National Bank. He asked for you. Said he needed your signature on something, but since you weren't available, I told him to come back another time." She looked concerned, almost apologetic. "He didn't leave details, but he seemed in a hurry." My chest tightened. First National, that was where Robert and I had our joint account. I had sat beside him in that office decades ago, signing our names on the dotted line, making sure both of us had equal access. We had always been cautious, Robert especially, never trusting anyone else with our finances. And yet now, with him gone, someone was suddenly desperate for my signature. A cold wave of suspicion swept over me. I could see Daniel's face in my mind, that practiced smile of his when he thought he had outsmarted someone. He was the one pushing papers, arranging sales closing deals. If he had tried to move money without me, without legal authority... My stomach turned. I thanked Helen, though my voice barely made it out. As soon as she left, I reached for the phone again. My hands didn't tremble this time. They were steady, fueled by something harder than grief. I dialed the number I hadn't used in years, Sarah Mitchell's office. Sarah and I had worked together back in my courthouse days. She was a sharp probate attorney, the kind who didn't let slick talkers get past her. When she answered, her voice was warm but professional. "Sarah Mitchell. How can I help, Sarah? It's Maggie Collins." There was a pause, then a softer tone. "Maggie. It's been ages. How are you?" I swallowed. "Not well. Robert. He passed." "Oh, Maggie." Her sigh carried genuine sorrow. "I'm so sorry. I hadn't heard." I closed my eyes. That's the problem. I wasn't even told. I wasn't at the funeral. My own son made sure of it. My voice cracked, but I pressed on. "And now? There's something with the bank. A man came here asking for my signature. It doesn't feel right." Sarah's tone sharpened immediately, the lawyer in her kicking in. "What bank? First National," I said. "Our joint account. Robert always said no one could touch it without both of us." She was silent for a moment, then firm. "Maggie, listen to me. Any power of attorney Robert may have signed for Daniel ended the moment Robert died. Legally, Daniel has no authority now. None. If he's trying to use that power to move money, that's fraud." Her words hit me like a gavel strike. Fraud. Not just betrayal, not just cruelty. A crime. I gripped the receiver tighter. "So if he tried, if he forged something..." "That would be serious," Sarah interrupted. "Especially if it involves joint assets. You need to be careful, Maggie, and you need to make sure you have any paperwork Robert left behind." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. My mind was racing. Robert had always been meticulous, leaving copies, notes, reminders. Somewhere he had prepared for this. "Sarah," I whispered, "would you come see me? I don't trust Daniel. I think he's moving faster than I can keep up." "I'll be there tomorrow morning," she said without hesitation. "Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. Let me handle it." When I hung up, I sat back in the chair, the phone still warm against my ear. My heart was pounding, but not just from grief now. Something else had rooted itself inside me. Resolve. I stared out the window at the courtyard where two residents shuffled slowly down the path. My life had been reduced to this small, quiet space. Daniel thought he had cornered me here, tucked away powerless. But he had underestimated me. I had spent decades in courthouses reading documents, watching cases unravel because someone tried to cut corners or outsmart the law. I knew the signs, and now I was seeing them in my own son. The betrayal still burned raw and merciless, but beneath it was a sharper edge. If Daniel wanted to erase me, he had chosen the wrong woman to try. The maple leaves outside rustled against the glass as though reminding me that time was moving forward. Robert's name still echoed in my mind, but with it came the memory of his steady hand on mine, his voice telling me to stand firm. I straightened in my chair. Tomorrow, Sarah would come, and together we would start pulling the threads of whatever Daniel thought he had stitched up so neatly. For the first time since I had opened that newspaper, I felt something close to clarity. Grief was still heavy on my chest, but it was now mixed with determination. If Daniel had touched what wasn't his, if he had signed his name where Robert's should have been, then he had left a trail. And I knew better than most how to follow a trail straight to the truth. The following morning, Sarah appeared at Rosewood, her briefcase tucked neatly under her arm, her expression steady but warm. She was dressed the way I remembered from the courthouse days, tailored navy suit glasses perched low on her nose, every inch the professional I had always admired. "Maggie," she said softly as she took the chair across from me in the lounge. "I'm so sorry about Robert. I wish our reunion were under different circumstances." Her sympathy nearly undid me again, but I steadied myself. "Thank you, Sarah. I still can't believe it, and I can't forgive Daniel for shutting me out." She opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick manila folder. "I went through my old files last night," she explained. "Robert was my client in 2019. I still had this." She slid the folder across the table. I reached for it, my hands trembling as I unfolded the cover. There, stamped and notarized, was Robert's last will and testament. The date was clear: July 10th, 2019. His signature strong despite the tremor he already had from his heart medication. Sarah pointed to the highlighted section. "Here it is. He made sure you were protected. The house in Bexley is yours outright, valued at about $350,000. He designated you to receive his retirement account as well. And Maggie, he included a share of Collins Hardware's profits for you. Not everything, but enough to make sure you had income." I bit my lip, blinking back tears as I traced the signature with my finger. He had thought of me. Even in the midst of his own declining health, he had made sure I would not be left alone or without security. My chest ached with love and sorrow. "He never told me all this," I whispered. "He probably wanted to spare you the worry," Sarah said gently. But he was clear about one thing: Daniel couldn't touch any of it without going through probate court. This document had to be filed. If it isn't on record, Daniel is hiding it. And that's not just selfish. It's illegal. The word illegal hung in the air. I looked up sharply. "So he's deliberately keeping this from me? To take it all?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She folded her hands, her voice calm but firm. "From what you've told me, it's very possible. He was the primary contact. He arranged the funeral in secret, and now he's sniffing around the bank. It adds up. But Maggie, this will gives us leverage. It's the law. If Daniel tries to bypass it, he's going to have a problem." I pressed the paper to my chest as though I could hold Robert close through the ink and the lines. My tears fell silently onto the folder. "He thought of me," I murmured, "even when Daniel wouldn't." Sarah leaned in. "That's right. Robert wanted you secure. He trusted me to make sure this was done properly. And I will." I let out a shaky breath. My grief was still raw, but beneath it was something stronger now. Robert had left me more than memories. He had left me the tools to stand. "What do we do next?" I asked. Sarah's eyes sharpened with purpose. "First, we confirm whether Daniel has filed this with probate court. If he hasn't, we'll make a filing ourselves. Then we put a hold on the accounts to prevent any funny business. I'll need you to authorize me to act on your behalf." You'll be safe, Maggie. I promise. I nodded slowly, absorbing her words. For weeks I had felt powerless, tucked away in this facility, cut off from my husband, and now betrayed by my son. But here in my hands was proof that Robert had not abandoned me. He had trusted me with his legacy, and trusted Sarah to help me protect it. The ache in my chest was still there, but alongside it rose a quiet flame. Daniel might think he had erased me, but he had underestimated his own mother. I slid the folder back across the table to Sarah, my hand steady now. "Let's do it," I said. "Let's make sure he doesn't get away with this." Her answering smile was small but resolute. "That's exactly what we'll do." I sat back, closing my eyes for a moment. Robert's face came to me, not in the hospital bed, not in the obituary column, but at our kitchen table years ago, passing me the bread with that familiar smile. He had trusted me then, and he trusted me still through every line of that will. The sorrow was sharp, but for the first time since the newspaper had fallen into my lap, I felt something steadier than despair. I felt ready. Sarah called me the following week. Her tone brisk, but tinged with something new. Urgency. "Maggie," she said, "I want you to meet someone. He's a reporter with the Columbus Ledger. His name is Owen Parker. He's been looking into real estate transactions downtown, and Daniel's name keeps surfacing. I think it's time you hear what he has to say." I felt a chill, but I agreed. Sarah picked me up from Rosewood the next morning, her car pulling into the circular drive as if she'd done it 100 times. The ride into the city was quiet, the streets of Columbus busy with morning traffic, but my mind louder than the horns and engines. I clutched Robert's folder on my lap as though it were armor. We met Owen at a small cafe near the courthouse. He was younger than I expected, early 30s, tall with an eager look that reminded me of a law clerk on his first big case. His notebook lay open in front of him, pen ready. He shook my hand respectfully. "Mrs. Collins, thank you for coming. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," I murmured, still cautious, unsure how much of myself I wanted to lay bare to a stranger. He leaned forward. "I've been digging into property sales downtown. A commercial building at High and Broad changed hands on May 14th. The same day your husband passed. Records show it was owned by Collins Hardware, Inc., but the sale went through under unusual circumstances. No probate filing, no public notice." My breath caught. That building. Robert fought for it. He said it was the cornerstone of expansion, that one day it would keep the business alive for Daniel. Why would he sell it? Owen's eyes met mine steady. He didn't. The buyer was a shell corporation registered 2 weeks prior. The signatory on the seller's side. Daniel Collins. The air left my lungs. My hand clutched the folder tighter. That was the day Robert died. Daniel. He knew. He was already moving money before his father's body was even cold. Sarah placed a hand gently over mine. "This is why I wanted you to meet Owen. The paper trail is damning, Maggie, but we need more. Confirmation from you any documents Robert left that contradict Daniel's authority." Owen scribbled notes quickly. "I don't need everything. Just enough to verify. If you let me publish, people will know he can't hide behind closed doors anymore." I shook my head slowly, trying to process. My son hadn't just excluded me from a funeral. He had orchestrated a theft timed to the hour of Robert's death. The betrayal pressed on me like a physical weight. Why would he risk so much? I asked quietly, though the answer already twisted inside me. Because Owen said carefully, once an asset is sold, it's hard to claw it back. He probably thought no one would notice, but someone did. I sat back, the coffee on the table, untouched. Images of Daniel as a boy flooded me again. The scraped knees, the baseball glove too big for his hand, his smile when Robert clapped him on the shoulder. That boy had vanished, replaced by a man who moved money through shell companies while his father drew his last breath. I turned to Sarah. If Daniel signed those papers on May 14th, then he used a power that no longer existed. Robert was gone. The law. Exactly, Sarah said firmly. POA ends at death. He had no authority. That sale is not only unethical, it's potentially void. And Owen's investigation proves he knew what he was doing. My throat tightened. He thought no one would fight him. He thought burying his father without me, there would keep me quiet. Owen looked up from his notes, his voice softer now. But you're not quiet, Mrs. Collins. You're here. And if you're willing, I can make sure people listen. The cafe around us buzzed with the ordinary sounds of life. Cups clinking laughter, the hiss of the espresso machine. But at our table the air was taut with the weight of what had been revealed. I glanced at Sarah, then back at Owen. I don't want scandal for the sake of scandal. Robert would never forgive me if this became a circus. But if this is the only way to stop Daniel... Owen nodded. I understand, I'll be discreet. But the truth has power, and once it's out there, Daniel won't be able to hide. I exhaled slowly, my fingers smoothing the edge of Robert's will inside the folder. The ache of grief was still there, but a sharper determination had begun to take root. My son wasn't just cruel. He was calculated, deliberate, and willing to break the law to erase me. I looked Owen in the eye. I'll find what Robert left. And when I do, you'll have your proof. He closed his notebook with a decisive snap. That's all I need. Sarah drove me back to Rosewood later that morning. The city streets blurred past the window, but my mind stayed locked on one image, Daniel's signature scrawled on a contract, the ink drying even as Robert's heart gave out. By the time we pulled into the driveway, I knew. This wasn't just about mourning anymore. It was about justice. And Daniel had just shown me exactly where to begin. 2 days later, while I was sitting in the courtyard at Rosewood with a blanket over my knees, I noticed a familiar figure walking slowly toward me. Pastor John Miller, tall and slightly stooped with his white collar peeking from beneath his jacket, carried himself with the same calm dignity I remembered from every Sunday service Robert and I had attended at St. Mark's. For a moment I thought I was imagining him there, but then he lifted his hand in greeting. "Maggie," he said gently, his voice steady. "I hope I'm not intruding." I blinked against the sunlight. "Pastor John? What are you doing here?" He lowered himself into the chair across from me, resting his hands on the cane he carried more for habit than necessity. "I came because I was surprised. Shocked, really. I expected to see you at Robert's service last week. When you didn't come, I thought, well, I didn't know what to think." My throat tightened. I looked down at my hands folded tightly in my lap. "I wasn't told, I whispered. Daniel never told me. I found out in the newspaper." Pastor John's brow furrowed deep lines etching across his forehead. "That can't be right. Robert asked me only a few days before he passed to make sure you were notified. He told me plainly, 'Please make sure Maggie knows.' Those were his words. He wanted you there." The tears welled instantly, hot and unrelenting. He said that I asked my voice breaking. He did, the pastor replied, his eyes kind but heavy with sadness. He was very clear. "I asked Daniel about you, and he told me you had declined, that you felt it would be too much for you." I accepted his word, though I was puzzled. Now I see I was deceived. My heart twisted, the grief and betrayal intertwining so tightly I could hardly breathe. Robert had wanted me there. He had thought of me in his final days, and still I had been shut out by my own son. "Daniel told you I refused." My voice grew sharp with disbelief. Pastor John nodded solemnly. "He said you didn't want to be contacted, that you wished to remember Robert in your own way. It didn't sit right with me at the time, but I didn't question it further. I regret that now." I pressed a trembling hand to my chest. "He lied. He stood there and lied to you, to the church, to everyone, just to erase me." Pastor John reached across the table, covering my hand with his. "I can't take away the pain, Maggie. But I can tell you the truth. Your husband's last request was for you to be at his side, and Daniel went against that." The words sliced through me, brutal but necessary. I could almost hear Robert's voice again, that steady tone that had carried me through decades of storms. He had wanted me with him. Daniel had stolen even that from me. For a long moment I couldn't speak. The courtyard noises faded. The shuffle of other residents, the chirping of birds, the rustle of the flag in the breeze. All I could hear was the echo of Robert's plea and the hollow ring of Daniel's deception. Finally, I drew in a shaky breath. "Thank you for telling me, Pastor. I needed to hear it even if it breaks me all over again." His eyes softened. "I wish I had asked more questions. I wish I hadn't trusted Daniel's word so easily. But I will stand by you now, Maggie. Whatever comes, the truth is on your side." I nodded, gripping his hand as though it were the last anchor in a world that kept shifting under my feet. "The truth," I said quietly. "That's all I want. The truth and the dignity Robert deserved." Pastor John squeezed my hand before rising slowly to his feet. "Hold on to that. You'll need it in the days ahead." I watched him walk back toward the gate, his figure growing smaller with each step. My heart ached, but something inside me hardened at the same time. Daniel's lie was not just cruel, it was deliberate. He had manipulated even the church to cover his tracks. As the afternoon light stretched across the courtyard, I sat very still, Robert's last words replaying in my mind. "Please make sure Maggie knows. He had wanted me there." That truth, painful as it was, lit a fire deep within me. Daniel could twist papers, forge signatures, even stage funerals in secret. But he couldn't rewrite Robert's love or erase the truth now that I had heard it. I lifted my head and let the sun warm my face, my grief mixing with a rising determination. Robert's voice was with me still, and I would not let it be silenced again. The following Monday, Sarah picked me up from Rosewood and drove me downtown to First National Bank. The city looked different than it had when Robert and I used to walk those streets together. Shinier in places, harsher in others. I sat stiffly in the passenger seat, my fingers twisting the strap of my purse. When we entered the marble lobby of the bank, the cool air smelled faintly of polish and paper. A clerk led us downstairs to the vault where rows of brass safety deposit boxes lined the walls. I remembered Robert bringing me here years ago, his quiet pride in making sure everything we owned was properly documented and protected. The banker, a middle-aged man with wire-rim glasses, placed the key into my hand. "Box 327, he said gently. My palms were sweating as I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door gave way with a soft click. Inside was a plain manila envelope worn at the edges. My name was written across the front in Robert's unmistakable handwriting. Maggie. My breath hitched. For a moment I couldn't move. Sarah put a hand on my shoulder. "Go ahead," she whispered. I carried the envelope to a small private room the bank provided. With shaking hands, I broke the seal. The first thing I saw was a photocopy of the 2019 will. Robert's signature, the notary stamp, everything intact. Beneath it, folded neatly, was a single page of lined paper in his hand. I unfolded it carefully. The ink faded but clear. "My dearest Maggie, if you are reading this, it means I wasn't able to tell you myself. I love you more than words can ever say. You have been my strength, my partner, my home. Please don't let anyone, not even our son, push you aside. Daniel has his ambition, but you have the truth and the law on your side. Protect what is yours. Protect what we built together. Always yours, Robert." The words blurred as the tears came hot and fast. I pressed the letter to my chest, rocking slightly, the sound of my sobs filling the quiet room. Memories washed over me. Our wedding in 1978, the day we signed the lease for Collins Hardware, the nights we stayed up late balancing ledgers at the kitchen table. His laughter when the power went out and we ate dinner by candlelight. 45 years of a life lived side by side, reduced now to a page of ink and the echo of his voice in my mind. Sarah sat quietly across from me, her eyes lowered, giving me the space to grieve. After a long while, I wiped my face with the back of my hand and looked at her. "He knew," I said, my voice trembling. "He knew Daniel might do this, and he left this for me so I'd have the strength to fight." She nodded. "This letter isn't just sentimental, Maggie, it's evidence. It proves Robert's intentions. Combined with the will, it's powerful." I held the letter again, the paper trembling between my fingers. He trusted me to carry this through. I won't let him down. Sarah leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. Then that's what we'll do. We'll take this will and this letter and we'll make sure Daniel doesn't erase you. I slipped the documents back into the envelope with care as though handling something sacred. Every line of Robert's handwriting felt like he was speaking to me across the divide of death, urging me not to surrender. Walking out of the bank, the sunlight was blinding. I clutched the envelope close to my chest, the city bustling around me. For weeks I had been stumbling in grief, but now I carried proof. Proof that Robert had thought of me, loved me, and prepared for me to continue the fight. As Sarah drove us back to Rosewood, I sat straighter in my seat, the envelope resting on my lap. The sorrow was still sharp, but underneath it was a current of resolve. Daniel might have believed he had buried me along with Robert, but he was wrong. I was still here, and now I had Robert's voice urging me on. By the time we reached the driveway of the facility, I knew the truth with absolute clarity. Daniel's greatest mistake was underestimating his own mother. And now, with Robert's words in my hands, I would not stop until the truth was laid bare. The day after we left the bank, Sarah moved quickly. She knew the courts, knew the clerks, knew how to get a petition filed before Daniel could make another move. She picked me up early in the morning and drove us straight to the Franklin County Probate Court in downtown Columbus. I hadn't been inside that building in years, but the smell of paper and polish was the same. The marble floors echoed beneath our steps as Sarah guided me through security and into the clerk's office. She carried the manila envelope with Robert's will and letter, inside her face set with quiet determination. At the counter, she introduced herself with calm authority. "I'm filing a petition to open probate for Robert Collins, deceased. We're also requesting a freeze on all accounts and assets until the court reviews the will." The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, took the documents and began stamping them. The sound of the rubber stamp hitting the paper was strangely satisfying, each thud like a door closing in Daniel's face. It took hours, but by the end of the day we walked out with an order in place. The court had granted a temporary restraining order. All bank accounts, all transfers, all property sales were to be frozen, pending review. Daniel could no longer move money, no longer shuffle papers into the shadows. Back at Rosewood, Sarah sat with me in the lounge explaining what came next. "This is just the beginning. The court will set a hearing date. We'll have to prove the will, prove Robert's intent, but right now Daniel can't touch a cent." For the first time in weeks, I let out a breath that felt like relief. "Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for giving me something solid." She smiled faintly. "It's Robert who gave it to you. I'm just carrying his words to the right place." That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky outside my window in streaks of orange and purple, the phone on the nightstand rang. I knew the number before I even picked it up. My hand steadied on the receiver. "Mom?" His voice was sharp, tense. I didn't answer right away. "Do you know what you've done?" Daniel snapped. "You went to the court. You froze everything. Do you understand what that means for me?" My heart pounded, but my voice came calm. "It means you can't take what doesn't belong to you." His laugh was bitter harsh. "You're destroying my career. Do you realize that I had deals lined up? Partnerships. Now everyone's calling me, asking questions, and it's because of you." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. "Because of me, or because you moved money the day your father died." There was silence on the line, heavy and telling. "You're pathetic," he said finally, his tone icy. "You've been living in that place, wasting away. You think you can suddenly rise up and ruin everything I've built. You're not strong enough for this, Mom." I drew a breath, steady and slow. "Daniel, I may be old. I may be tired. But I know the law. And I know the truth. You can't bury either of them, no matter how hard you try." His voice cracked with anger. "You're going to regret this." "No," I said firmly, surprising even myself with the strength in my tone. "The only one who will regret this is you. Because you chose greed over your father. You chose lies over your mother." The silence stretched again. I could hear his breathing fast and ragged on the other end. Then came the slam of a phone hanging up. I lowered the receiver slowly, my hand trembling just a little after the adrenaline faded. I set it back on the nightstand and sat in the quiet room staring at the fading light outside. Grief was still my constant companion, but tonight it was joined by something stronger. The law was on my side. Robert's words were on my side. And Daniel, whether he liked it or not, was now standing on quicksand. I folded my hands in my lap, the echo of his threats still ringing in my ears. But beneath it all, I felt steady. For the first time since Robert's death, I knew I had struck a blow Daniel could not ignore. The sanctuary of St. Mark's smelled faintly of old wood and candle wax, familiar scents that brought back decades of Sundays with Robert at my side. That morning, the pews were filled not with parishioners for worship, but with neighbors, business partners, and friends who had heard about the memorial service. It was the first time I had walked into that church since Robert's obituary had blindsided me, and every step down the aisle felt heavy with both grief and resolve. Heads turned as I entered. Whispers drifted like wind through the crowd. They all knew I had not been at the funeral. They all knew I had been absent. What they didn't know yet was why. Pastor John met me near the front and guided me to a reserved seat. His hand was steady on my arm, an anchor in the storm. When he stepped to the pulpit, his eyes swept across the congregation before settling for a heartbeat on me. Before Robert passed, he began his voice carrying strong and clear. He spoke words to me I will never forget. He said, "Please make sure Maggie knows. She should be there." Those words were his final request. Gasps rose from the pews. A murmur of disbelief ran through the room. I felt a tear slip down my cheek as the truth at last reached ears beyond mine. Pastor John straightened his voice firm. "I was told Mrs. Collins had declined to come." That was not true. Robert wanted her by his side, and she was denied that. The silence that followed was thick, charged. My hands shook in my lap, but my spine stayed straight. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt his presence honored publicly, not erased. Next, Sarah rose from her seat, her briefcase in hand. She approached the front with the quiet authority of a woman who had lived her life in courtrooms. Opening the folder, she placed the will on the lectern for all to see. "This is Robert Collins's last will and testament signed in July 2019, notarized and legally binding," she said firmly. "It names his wife, Margaret Collins, as beneficiary of the family home in Bexley, his retirement accounts, and a share of Collins hardware. It places limits on the authority of his son Daniel Collins, restricting him from selling certain assets without oversight." She held the document high. This was never filed with probate court. It was concealed. That concealment served no one but Daniel himself. A low wave of whispers rippled again through the pews. I saw faces turn toward my son, who sat several rows back in his tailored suit, his jaw clenched tight. Finally, Owen Parker, younger than most in the room but confident, stepped forward with a manila folder of his own. He pulled out copies of property records, the ink fresh from the county office. "This is the deed for the commercial building at High and Broad," he explained. "On May 14th, the day Robert Collins passed away, that property was transferred to a shell company created 2 weeks earlier. The seller of record Daniel Collins. He signed using a power of attorney that expired at the moment of Robert's death. That sale was not valid. It was an act of fraud. The reaction was immediate. Shocked voices filled the sanctuary. A business associate seated near Daniel stood abruptly and walked out. Another leaned in to whisper to his companion, their faces grim. I turned slightly, watching Daniel's composure crack. His face flushed red, his lips pressed into a hard line. He tugged at his tie, shifting in his seat under the weight of so many eyes. The confident broker who had once boasted about his deals was shrinking into a cornered man-caught. Pastor John raised his hands, calling for quiet. "We are not here to condemn, but to honor Robert's life and truth. What has been hidden is now revealed. And the truth is that Maggie Collins was his wife, his partner, and his chosen beneficiary. The crowd stilled. For the first time in weeks, I felt a wave of strength wash through me. The lies Daniel had woven were unraveling in front of the very people whose respect he craved most. When the service ended, people came to me. Old neighbors clasped my hands, murmuring apologies that I hadn't been told, promising to stand with me. Former employees of the hardware store hugged me, tears in their eyes. Even a few of Daniel's clients stopped shaking their heads as they left, refusing to meet his gaze. I sat quietly through it all, the weight of Robert's letter tucked safely in my purse. The grief was still there, sharp and undeniable, but mingled now with something harder: vindication. As the sanctuary emptied, I saw Daniel rise and storm out the side door, his shoulders rigid, his phone already pressed to his ear. I didn't need to hear his words to know the calls he was making. Frantic, desperate attempts to salvage what had slipped through his fingers. I stayed seated a while longer, the afternoon sun streaming through the stained glass, painting the pews in colors of ruby and gold. Robert's presence felt closer than ever. His voice echoed in memory. Protect what we built together. And for the first time since I read his name in that cold obituary, I felt certain that I was doing exactly that. A week after the memorial service, Sarah and I sat side by side in the probate courtroom. The paneled walls smelled faintly of varnish, the judge's bench looming high above, reminding me of all the years I had spent in places like this as a clerk. But this time I wasn't a quiet employee. I was the widow whose place had been stolen and now returned. The judge adjusted his glasses, flipping through the file Sarah had presented. The certified copy of Robert's will, the notarization, the letter Robert had left in the safety deposit box. All of it lay on the desk. "This court finds the 2019 will to be valid," he said finally. His voice was calm but authoritative, and the words rang through me like a bell. Margaret Collins is entitled to her spousal elective share, including the property in Bexley retirement accounts, and ongoing interests in Collins Hardware Incorporated. I closed my eyes briefly, a wave of relief flooding me. Robert's intentions had been honored. He had not been erased. The judge's tone sharpened as he continued. "Further, this court orders all assets and transactions conducted under expired power of attorney after Mr. Collins's death to be subject to investigation. Those matters fall to law enforcement and regulatory bodies." He paused, his gaze settling on Daniel where he sat with his attorney at the other table. "This court will not tolerate fraud." Daniel shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, his hands clenched together as though he could hold his crumbling world intact. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, their cameras aimed at the doors. Owen Parker stood among them, his notebook ready, his face focused. He caught my eye and gave me a small nod as though to say, "We did it." Sarah guided me down the steps slowly, her hand steadying my elbow. "You did well," she murmured. "Robert would be proud." Later that week, news broke across local television and newspapers. Daniel Collins, real estate broker, under investigation for fraudulent transactions. Words like license suspension and forged documents filled the headlines. Clients pulled away, deals evaporated. The phone at his office rang unanswered, his name whispered in tones of disappointment and anger. Meanwhile, Collins Hardware returned to stability. The Board of Trustees convened without Daniel reinstating oversight, but they asked me to sit in on meetings to offer guidance as Robert once had. I walked back into that store, its shelves lined with bolts and tools, the faint smell of oil and sawdust rising to greet me. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt as though I had stepped into a place where he still lingered. Standing behind the counter, I ran my hand across the worn wood, remembering the nights Robert and I had balanced the books there, Daniel doing homework in the corner. So much had changed, but the heartbeat of the place was the same. Daniel, however, grew smaller in the city's eyes. Friends who once toasted his ambition now avoided him. Former partners distanced themselves. Even at church, whispers followed him. He stopped showing his face in familiar circles, his once polished reputation tarnished beyond repair. One evening I heard his voice on the phone again. It wasn't rage this time. It was quiet or weary, as if the fight had drained from him. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Do you know what they're saying about me?" I listened in silence, my heart aching, but resolute. "Daniel," I said gently but firmly, "the truth has a way of speaking louder than any of us. You chose this path." There was no reply, only the sound of his breathing, heavy, uneven. Then the line clicked, leaving me once more in the stillness of my room. I sat there long after staring at the maple tree outside the window of rosewood. Its branches swayed steady against the evening sky. Daniel was alone now, wrapped in the consequences of his choices, while I carried Robert's words like a lantern in the dark. Protect what we built together. Justice had been done, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in truth laid bare. And that truth was enough. A month later, the garden behind St. Mark's Church was alive with late summer blooms. Bam! Roses climbed the trellis, their petals opening wide in the afternoon sun, and the old oak trees cast gentle shade across the stone benches. I stood near the fountain, the letter Robert had written folded carefully in my hands. It felt right to end this chapter here in the place where our community had gathered so many times, where whispers of grief had already turned into whispers of truth. Only a small circle had come. Former employees of Collins' hardware neighbors from Bexley, a few friends from the congregation. No cameras, no headlines, no speeches. Just the people who had known Robert not as a name in a transaction or a figure in an estate, but as the man who fixed their door hinges on weekends, who offered credit to those who couldn't pay until payday, who taught apprentices how to use their hands with pride. I unfolded the letter slowly, the paper soft from where I had held it too often these past weeks. My voice shook at first, but then grew stronger as I read aloud. "My dearest Maggie, please don't let anyone, not even our son, push you aside. Protect what is yours. Protect what we built together." The words settled over the garden like a blessing. I felt the tears rise again, but this time they were not the raw sobs of grief. They were gentler, like a release. I folded the letter and placed it back in my purse close to my heart. After a moment, I stepped forward and addressed the small group. Robert believed in hard work, in honesty, and in giving others a chance. In his honor, I'm establishing the Robert Collins Apprenticeship Fund. It will provide scholarships for young men and women who want to learn the trade, who want to build something with their hands the way he did. That's how his legacy will live. Not in court battles, not in bitterness, but in opportunity for others. There was a murmur of approval, quiet claps from those gathered. A young man who had once worked part-time at the store wiped his eyes. "He taught me more than just hardware," he said softly. "He taught me how to be proud of what I do." I smiled at him, my heart full. This was how Robert deserved to be remembered, not as a figure in legal disputes, but as a man who left pieces of himself in the lives of others. When the gathering ended, people lingered in the garden, sharing stories of Robert. How he kept extra keys at the store for forgetful neighbors, how he insisted on paying his apprentices fairly even when business was tight, how he loved the smell of sawdust in the morning. Their laughter mixed with tears, a melody of remembrance that warmed me in a way no court ruling ever could. Eventually they drifted away one by one until I was left standing by the fountain. The late afternoon light spilled golden across the garden, and I tilted my face upward. The sky was wide and endless, a canvas of blue that seemed to whisper of peace. I whispered aloud, though no one was there to hear. Justice was never about revenge. It was about dignity. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of roses. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, letting the words settle inside me. For so long I had been drowning in grief and betrayal. Now, standing here with Robert's voice still echoing in my heart, I felt lighter. I had not only protected what he built, I had found a way to carry it forward. I turned to leave the garden, the sound of my footsteps soft on the stone path. I carried no anger with me, no hunger for retribution, only the quiet strength of a woman who had endured, who had been cut down but refused to vanish. And as I walked out into the evening, I carried with me the certainty that Robert's legacy and my dignity were safe. If you've ever known what it feels like to be silenced, to be pushed aside, I hope my story reminds you that quiet strength can be louder than cruelty. Share your own moments of quiet power, the times you chose dignity over anger. I'd love to hear them, and together we can keep these stories alive.